I'm Dr. Jennifer Dickey. I'm a professor at Kennesaw State University. I am also the coordinator of the public history program there. I've been at Kennesaw for 18 years now, I guess, and it's been just a barrel of fun from beginning to end.
My name is Kathrine Graham. I am currently an educator here at the Bartow History Museum. I graduated from Kennesaw State University in May of 2023, and I took the research seminar class with Dr. Dickey, where we wrote and then later published these papers in the fall of 2022.
I got interested in this subject of the state historic sites when my mom suggested that we go and visit all the state historic sites in Georgia. So I really kind of got started on this with her, and then after she passed away, I was really determined to carry forward with the mission and go and visit all the sites. And as I was doing that, I realized that there was no guidebook for the state historic site system, and decided that I would write one. And along the way, one of my colleagues said, "Hey, you should do that as a senior research seminar and let students contribute to the chapters." And I thought, what a great idea. So that's kind of how this project evolved, and ended up teaching a research seminar class where students did research and contributed what became chapters in this book.
Yeah, so what got me interested was that I took the class, and Dr. Dickey heavily suggested multiple times to us that we should take this class, and that it would be awesome to put on our resumes because the end goal was to be published. And I had taken other classes with Dr. Dickey, so I was thrilled to take another one, and I needed to take my first research seminar.
It's hard to really specify one particular thing that was the most interesting. I mean, there were so many amazing things that I found as I was doing research on this, from like the Fort King George story, where there were two guys who were at that outpost, which was the worst outpost in North America, for 7 years in the 1720s to up until 1734, the fact that the state of Georgia invited the Braves mascot, Chief Nakahoma, to the parade when they were opening New Echota because, we're all Indians or whatever. I mean, just so many little nuggets that I came across in the course of the research, or that the students came across that they shared with me throughout this project. It was just a really fun project, and most importantly, I got to go visit all these 16 sites over and over and over again. And when I go back and I look at the book now, I want to get back on the road and go back and visit these sites again. So.
Yeah, I think for me it was just how difficult it was to nail down a lot of the timelines, especially dealing specifically with Native American and Indigenous histories. A lot of it is based on best guesses. Like Dr. Dickey talks about in the lecture, sometimes things are misdated. And I think it was also interesting to see how they spoke about things a little bit more insensitively when they first created this as a historic site in the 50s and 60s.
Good evening. Good evening. Quiet, so I guess everybody starts. Welcome to the Bartow History Museum's evening lecture for the month of June. We're glad you could join us this evening. If you don't know me, I'm Trey Gaines. I'm director of the museum, and I hope to see you again sometime soon. But before you go, let's get on with tonight's program. Let me give some upcoming announcements. If you're not familiar with the museum, there's always something going on. For the month of July, we've got our next installment of camp. It's a zoo camp. What are the ages for that camp?
5 to 7.
5 to 7-year-olds. If you've got 5 to 7-year-old kids, grandkids, neighbor kids, kids you just see on the street,
Bring them in.
We'll take them. That's going to be a week-long camp full of fun zoo activities here in this room, in this museum, and crafts, games, activities galore. On July 12th, we've got a lecture. That's a Saturday, July 12th. The Georgia Volunteers Association will be here and hosting their July regular meeting here at the museum, and they're having a speaker, Dr. Alice Taylor Colbert, who is from South Carolina but did a lot of work here in Georgia. She's an expert on Cherokee, all things Cherokee, and she's going to be here to talk about the lower town Cherokee history. It's free and open to the public, so yes, we're all invited to attend that meeting. It starts at 10:30 that morning here in the room, in this room, and then come enjoy the meeting, the lecture, and see the museum as well. And if you want something else to do that day,
we're dueling lectures happening.
this is Katie from the U Harley History Museum.
Hi. Thank you for the opportunity to share this. Also, I'm Katie Goby. I work for the City of New Harley, and on July 12th at 10 a.m. we have the New Harley Historical Society's annual meeting, and we have, I think it's a theme, bringing people from the Carolinas. We have Dr. Linda Carnes-McNaughton coming to give a talk about her work with the Queen Anne's Revenge, Blackbeard ship that she worked with other researchers and archaeologists and excavated. So it's going to be a really great opportunity to also learn a little history and see a local museum, but it's hard to choose which one you're going to go to.
So Cherokee or Pirates?
Thank you for letting me share.
So, but two great events that we hope you can join us for at least one of those events. And then finally, the end of July, July 21st to the 25th, will be our final installment of summer camp called Time Travelers. Is that also for that same age group?
No, that is 8 to 12.
8 to 12-year-olds. Same rules apply. If you've got those kids in your life, that's 8 to 12-year-olds. We'd love to have them at camp with us this summer. Well, without further ado, let me get started and introduce our guests for the evening. We've got two great speakers with us this evening. Jennifer Dickey is a professor of history and the coordinator of the museums and the history of public programs at Kennesaw State University. Previously, she was the campus preservationist at Berry College. She continues to serve as a preservation consultant. I'm going to get that word out here eventually. She has worked for the National Park Service and the Historic Preservation Division of Georgia. She is the author of A Tough Little Patch of History, Gone with the Wind and the Politics of Memory, and co-author of Memories of the Mansion, the History of Georgia's Governor's Mansion. And with her this evening is one of our own. Kathrine Graham is an educator here at the Bartow History Museum. Don't tell anybody I said that. And a former student of Dr. Dickey, who also contributed a chapter to the book tonight. So please join me in welcoming Jennifer and Kathrine.
Thank you, Trey, and thank you all for coming out tonight. And it's a real honor to be here tonight, and it's very exciting for me for this book to finally be out. This was truly a labor of love, and this was unlike any other book I've ever done because it involved work that was done by my students as well. Like Kathrine was one of several students who was in my research seminar class who contributed to this volume. But I also have to give a shout out because I have, I guess, 4 former students in the room here. If you're a former student of mine, raise your hand. Okay, so 5. So anyway, that nothing warms my heart more than running into my former students, especially when they're out there doing this good work. It's public history work. But this particular book really sort of had its genesis around 2015 when one day my mom said to me that she wanted me to take her to visit all of the state historic sites in Georgia. And I thought, oh Lord, how many are there? And turns out, really, there are only 16, so that wasn't that many. But so I began that quest with Mom. We started going periodically to visit sites, and we hit some of the biggies like Little White House and Dahlonega. And then Mom died in 2019, checked out right before COVID, and so I was a little bit shipwrecked after that. And then we had COVID, and I was even more shipwrecked as we were moving through COVID. But this idea of continuing these visits to these state historic sites sort of stuck with me. And so I kind of felt like I owed it to Mom to get out there and see all these sites. So I started going to more state historic sites. And as I was doing that, I realized that there was no guidebook to the state historic sites at all. And the website that DNR has for the state historic sites was a little thin on the history of a lot of these sites. And so I started thinking about doing a book. And then one day I was sitting around with one of my colleagues, David Parker, in the office. And I said, you know, I really want to do this book. It's kind of like each chapter would feature one of the state historic sites. And he said, you ought to do that as a research seminar and let the students help you. And I was like, what what a good idea. So the next thing I knew, I was teaching this research seminar, and it was, I think Kathrine can tell you, it was unlike the usual research seminars. Like each student had to adopt a state historic site. And I had gotten a little grant money for this project, so I was able to give them the state historic site pass, an annual pass, so they could go visit it as many times as they wanted over the course of the semester. And I told them at the beginning, I said, the work that you do in this class will someday get published. At that point, I had already been talking with University of Georgia Press about this, and they thought this was a great idea, and they had agreed to publish it by the time the semester was over, really, even though the book was still in a very early phase. But as I was doing some of my early research on this topic, I stumbled upon this ad, and I heard somebody talking about, look, it's an ad from Riches. This is from 1949 in the Atlanta Constitution, and as you can see, this gives me the title for my book. But I saw this ad, and I just went crazy. I was like, oh my gosh, this is like, okay, first of all, this has got to be my title. But also this is a little bit of foreshadowing. So this is 1949, and it's right as it's the post-World War II period, and it's right as the state of Georgia is starting to realize that they have a wealth of historic resources here, and that people will come to see these historic resources, right? So these sites, there are 33 sites that are listed here. Only 3 of the sites that are on here are actually subjects of this book or part of the state historic site system. There are a couple or 3, I guess, that are national park sites now. And then there are some that are actually state parks. So there's a difference between the state historic sites and the state parks, although there are 3 state historic sites that are located in state parks. So that's a little bit confusing, but hopefully this will all become clear as we go through this. But anyway, so this was 2 years before the state created something known as the Georgia Historical Commission, which was the entity that would really be the engine that drove the creation of our state historic site system that we have today. And what you see here is a map of the system, essentially as it is today. So historic sites and state parks are all under one umbrella, the Division of State Parks and Historic Sites under the Department of Natural Resources. I don't know if you can see on this map, but the little blue pentagons are the state historic sites. The blue dots are the parks. The black squares are what they call partner attractions. There are 3 of those that used to be state historic sites that were part of the system that are no longer. When the system downsized a few years ago, was during budget cuts, those sites were basically spun off to local entities, either cities or counties, for them to operate. That's the Jeff Davis site, the Lapham Patterson House, and the Robert Toombs House. But the ones that we're really focusing on are the ones that have the pentagons, and then the 3 sites that are part of the state parks. So the state park system is created in 1931, and the state very slowly begins creating state parks as recreation sites. And one of the earliest state parks that would go on to actually house one of the state historic sites is the Alexander Stephens State Park. Of course, Alexander Stephens was the vice president of the Confederacy. He was a state representative from Georgia. He was the governor of Georgia at the time of his death. And so his home site would be preserved, and a recreation park would be built or sort of in the area around it. And we'll take a look at that in a little bit. But this system is beginning to get built in the 30s. The CCC comes in, of course, Civilian Conservation Corps. They do a lot of the infrastructure work in some of these sites. They do infrastructure work at Alexander Stephens. They do infrastructure work at a site down in sort of the southeast corner, Kolomoki Mounds, which is a really great mound site, woodland era Native American site. But then it's not until the 50s that we get the creation of the Historical Commission, and we start moving forward with this notion to actually start preserving, have the state own these historic sites and preserve them. So you can see here, the state park system was created in 31, and we get 2 sites that are within state parks, Alexander Stevens and Kolomoki, that are both established in the 30s. And then in 51, we get the creation of the Historical Commission. And so you get a big chunk of these sites that are part of the system today that are basically purchased by the state in the 50s and 60s. There was a big focus in the 50s on Native American sites, especially Cherokee sites. You see the Van House there, New Echota in 62, Etowah Indian Mounds, as Kathrine will talk about, was in 53. So the Historical Commission was very active. They actually acquired about 17 sites over their lifespan. The commission existed from 51 to 72 and acquired 17 sites. Again, some of those were divested by the state over time, but that's kind of makes up the core group here. And then when the Historical Commission was decommissioned by Jimmy Carter, he created another entity called the Georgia Heritage Trust, whose sole purpose was to identify and acquire sites for the state that were worthy of preservation. And in 1973, when the trust was created, it was essentially unfunded, so they couldn't really do very much. They managed to scrape together enough money to acquire the Wormslow site outside of Savannah. But then in 74, they reached peak funding, and they got about $12.5 million. Acquired 3 sites that year, and that was sort of the high water mark for the trust. They never really got very much funding after that, and were not able to do very much in terms of acquisition of sites after that. And then in 1980, the state acquires Roosevelt's Little White House. The Little White House had actually been run by the Roosevelt Memorial Commission from the time of FDR's death until 1980, and that commission was a hot mess, and there was a lot of mismanagement, and they were dying to get rid of it. So they essentially donated the site. The commission donated the site to the state, so the state took it over in 1980. And then the most recent acquisition by the state was Hardman Farm, which is just outside of Helen, and that was the site of a 19th century farm that stayed in one family from the very part of the 20th century up until the latter part of the 20th century, and that was the family of Governor Lamartine Hardman. So that is sort of the sequence, and those are the sites that are the focus of this book. You can see sort of geographically where they're located. You can see that sort of swath of desert of historic sites there. That doesn't mean there's not anything fun and interesting there. It just means that the state does not own any historic sites in that area. They did used to own, as I mentioned, the Jeff Davis capture site, which is kind of in the middle there in Irwinville, and then the Lapham Patterson House down in Thomasville, but no longer. So as I mentioned, the Historical Commission begins acquiring these sites, and Joseph Cummings was the chair of this commission. And he felt like he was always fighting this battle to get more funding for the commission to do their work. And by 1963, the commission had been in existence for 12 years, and he was really tangled up trying to get more and more funding. And he wrote this scathing letter to Governor Carl Sanders, and he's like, Disney World didn't exist yet. So he's like, we don't want to be a super Disneyland. We don't want Rock City syndrome here. The focus in Georgia needs to be on our historic sites. That's what tourists really want to see. They don't want to come here to have fun and frolic. They want to come here. We want to be Virginia, not Florida. We have more historic sites than any state on the East Coast other than Virginia. At least that's what Cummings was claiming. Whether that's true or not is a topic for another day. But that was the argument he was making to try to squeeze more money out of the governor and out of the state legislature at the time. It was somewhat successful, not wholly successful, I would say. But nevertheless, the state system continued to develop. The historical commission continued to acquire sites. And then we sort of settled on these 16 sites that have been under the purview of the Division of State Parks and Historic Sites now for probably close to about 15 or 20 years. So I just want to kind of whirl through what some of these sites are and give you a little sneak peek of them. I'm sure a lot of you had visited a lot of these sites. Some of you may have, I think there's probably one site in here that maybe nobody has visited. As the superintendent of Kolomoki Mounds said to me, you have to really want to come to Kolomoki Mounds to come to Kolomoki Mounds because it's not close to anything. But it's a fantastic site. And if you can get down to Blakely, Georgia, I highly encourage you to go. And that's the site that you see up there on the left, upper left. It's a woodland area, Native American site. It's a spectacular site. It has been a troubled site, historically speaking, in terms of its interpretation, because William Sears, the archaeologist who did most of the excavations in the 1950s, misdated it to the Mississippian period instead of the woodland period. So he was off by like, I don't know, 500 or 700 years, which is pretty big. And like all the other archaeologists who were, doing archaeology stuff at the time, disagreed with him and realized that, but nobody would really publicly speak out about it. So from the 50s until 1992, nobody wanted to do work on Kolomoki or really talk about Kolomoki because of the big Kolomoki problem. That's what it was called in archaeological circles, the Kolomoki problem. And in 92, Sears wrote an article called Mea Culpa, in which he admitted he had messed up the chronology. And anyway, so that sort of opened the floodgates. And now there's a lot of really new and interesting work going on there at Kolomoki. So it's a great site if you're ever down there. And the superintendent's warning aside, I highly recommend it. Etowah Mounds, which is the one you see on the right, the Mississippian era site. And then we have two Cherokee sites. The Van House, the Chief Van House, which was the first site that the Historical Commission acquired, and for many years was sort of their crown jewel. I mean, that was really a big thing for them to get this site and to be able to restore that house, which was the home of Chief Van. It too is not without controversy. If you're familiar with the historian Taya Miles, who in her research discovered that it was probably James Van's son rather than James Van who built the brick house here at the Chief Van House. So that's been something that the state historic sites have really wrestled with, how to deal with that interpretation at that site. And then New Echota, which was the Cherokee capital, declared the Cherokee capital of the Cherokee Nation in 1825, and then, of course, is abandoned with Cherokee removal by 1838. So I've organized these, not the way that I've organized them in the book, but I want to take you through them sort of thematically, which is the way the state organizes them on their website. In the book, I have organized them geographically because this is, in fact, a guidebook. So each chapter has information about the history of the site, but also information about what you need to look for and make sure you see when you go to tour the site. So I organized it geographically so you can sort of plan your trips to, like, North Georgia or Blakely, where there's only one site, or the coast. There's a cluster of sites along the coast. So these are not necessarily located in close proximity, although the Van House and New Echota are, but generally speaking, the sites that you may see on a particular slide are not necessarily located close to each other. The next thematic topic is coastal forts in colonial Georgia. So here we've got basically a site that predates the Georgia colony. Fort King George. And one of my favorite stories from all of the research that I did on this project was a story that students and I uncovered related to Fort King George. So the area between Florida and South Carolina was known as the debatable land in the 1720s. So, Georgia's not established. Oglethorpe arrives in February of 1733, right? So it's the debatable land in the 1720s. But the real fear was not from the Spanish down in Florida, but that the French were going to swoop in and figure out some waterway. They already had control of the Mississippi in Louisiana, and that they were going to figure out some way to get to the coast, the eastern coast of the colonies, right, in between Florida and South Carolina. So the folks in South Carolina decided they needed to build initially a series of forts. It turns out they only had money and time and energy for one fort somewhere along this coast in between Florida and South Carolina. So this becomes Fort King George. And this was a horrible, horrible place. 50% of the people who were posted there die of disease. It is a swamp. It's the middle of nowhere, near the mouth of the Altamaha River. It was just really horrible. Nobody wanted to get posted there. Everybody who was there complained, and then they died. I mean, it was just a bad scene all around. By the late 1720s, they've abandoned this fort, basically. The British pull all their troops out, except 2 guys. They leave 2 guys down at Fort King George for 7 years. This is like the worst post in all of North America. And these 2 guys are down there for 7 years. What they're doing for 7 years, I don't know, but they survived it apparently. Anyway, so these guys were truly intrepid. I mean, there were like Indian attacks. It was a swamp. There were mosquitoes, everything. It was bad. But anyway, so that's Fort King George. It's pre-Georgia, pre-colonial, as they're sort of working on the debatable land. Then we get our only Revolutionary War site, and that's Fort Morris. It's an earthen site that was a fort that was protecting the city of Sunbury. Anybody ever heard of Sunbury? Nobody's heard of Sunbury. I'd not heard of Sunbury until I started working on this project. Sunbury was a city that rivaled Savannah during the colonial period. Sunbury is one of these dead towns of Georgia. There's nothing there at the site of Sunbury except for this fort and a cemetery, although now the area around it is starting to be developed and they're like vacation homes and stuff. But the city of Sunbury no longer exists. But it was an important port city, and so this fort was constructed during the American Revolution to protect the city of Sunbury. It was resurrected as a fort during the War of 1812, and again during the Civil War, it was manned as a fort. And then it was sort of lost to history for many years, and then rediscovered as the Historical Commission was looking for a Revolutionary War site to add to their collection. And then one of the most visited sites is Wormslow, which was a plantation that was established by a gentleman named Noble Jones, who did everything. He came over on the boat with Oglethorpe. He was given this land grant that becomes the Wormslow Plantation. He was a doctor. He was a surveyor. He was a plantation owner. I mean, he did everything, He built a tabby house on this land that was known as Wormslow, and this property stayed in his family. So he comes in 1733, and that property stayed in his family until the 1970s. And then his family basically sold it to the Trust for Public Land, who then transferred it to the state of Georgia. The famous thing about Wormslow, there are the ruins of the tabby house there, but the famous thing is this mile-long drive coming into the site. These live oaks were planted at the beginning of the 20th century, so it's a really spectacular entrance to what's a really beautiful historic site. We have 3 Civil War sites. Alexander Stephens State Park, which includes Liberty Hall, Alexander Stephens' home, as well as his gravesite, because he's buried in his front yard, right there next to the little statue of him. It's a fantastic site. The house has been restored. The interpretation could be a little bit better, I would say. But it's certainly worth going to see. Fort McAllister, which you see down here at the bottom, was an earthen Confederate fort at the mouth of the Great Ogeechee River, this was the key to Savannah. They were basically protecting the city of Savannah, which was 12 miles upriver, from U.S. ships coming up the river. And it was only when Sherman got down to Savannah that this fort is finally captured by the U.S. Army as they come in from the land side rather than the river side. This fort restoration actually began when Henry Ford owned this land. This is down in that Richmond Hill area along the coast, and Henry Ford bought up a lot of land in that area. He had a winter home down there. And he was very interested in this history, and he began the restoration of this fort. Then it was owned by a number of other entities over the years until the state finally acquired it, and it is part of a state park. And then the last Civil War site, which opened in 1990, is Pickett's Mill, which is considered to be one of the most intact Civil War battlefield sites certainly in the country, and absolutely in Georgia. So that's not too far from here in Dallas. We have one site related to the gold rush. It also deals with Native American history, of course, with pushing the Trail of Tears and pushing the Cherokee out of this area, because this was Cherokee land when gold was discovered here. The city of Dahlonega did not exist when gold was discovered here. But the building that you see here is the 1836 courthouse in Dahlonega. It's one of the oldest public buildings in the state of Georgia. It was used as the courthouse from 1836 to the 1960s when a new courthouse was built in Lumpkin County. And then the state acquired this to use as a museum to tell the story of the first major gold rush in the United States. We have a couple of plantations in the Wormslow is was technically a plantation, even though the Jones family in the early years did not live on it. It was a plantation, but the State Historic Site Office does not categorize it as such. But 2 that they do lump under this category of plantations are Hoffel Broadfield Plantation, which was a rice plantation that was established in the early 1800s, and again was owned by the same family up until the 1970s. So generations of this family cultivated rice. They cultivated rice here into the 20th century and then converted it into a dairy farm. And when the last member of that family died in 1972, I believe, the land was, she had set it up for the land to go to the Trust for Public Land with the idea that it would then come to the state, which is what happened. And also, I want to point out that there's a cat in this picture. So, this is a great cat who will follow you around the site. It always makes me happy because it's a very friendly cat. Anyway, it's the only site in Georgia that has actually preserved and interprets the rice cultivation. So it is the only rice plantation in Georgia that you can go and visit. It's really spectacular, including the marshes where the rice fields are still there. And then there's Gerald Plantation, another site that stayed in the same family until the Trust for Public Land and then the Georgia Heritage Trust acquired it. Gerald Plantation was established by a gentleman named John Fitzgerald in 1847, and members of his family lived on this land and farmed this land until the 1970s. So the Gerald family started out basically growing cotton. John Fitz realized that this was not great cotton land where he was living, and he was going to starve to death. So he diversified. And the story at Gerald Plantation is really one of sort of diversification and ingenuity and industrialization in some ways, because the Gerald family basically started adding different sorts of services that they would provide to their neighbors. So they started a cotton gin, and then they started a lumber mill, and then a syrup making operation. So they were adding on all these different things that they could do to basically be able to make a living down in Jones County when cotton was not enough to make a living. And everything is still there. I mean, this house is the 1847 house. And members of the family were living in this right up almost until the time that it was donated to the state. So it's the preservation there is really remarkable, and it's a very immersive experience to go and visit this place. And then they sort of have this category of unique homes where they kind of lump together these things that they can't figure out where to put anything else. Up top you see Hardman Farm, which I mentioned is the newest of our state historic sites. It opened in 2014. It's a house that dates to the 1870s. A Confederate veteran by the name of James Nichols, who had contracted malaria and was having health problems, moved up here just outside of Helen. You can walk to Helen from this site. So he moved up to the mountains there to build a home, with hoping that it would help with his health issues. And then he eventually moved back to Atlanta. He sold it to a man named Calvin Honeycutt, who was a prosperous businessman from Atlanta who used it as a summer home. And then just after the turn of the century, the early part of the 20th century, Honeycutt sold it to Lamartine Hardman, who was the governor of Georgia in around 1927. He was one of the wealthiest men in Georgia in the 1920s. He was a medical doctor by training, but he was also a farmer and owned a lot of land and was very much interested in scientific farming and introducing best agricultural practices all across the state of Georgia. And so he really developed the farm here. This is the house itself is fantastic, but all the outbuildings are still there too. So you can sort of see the entire farming operation. The little White House, most of you are probably familiar with. This was Roosevelt's little hideaway here in Georgia. Roosevelt discovered Warm Springs in 1924. He had contracted polio in 1921, and paralysis came after that. And so he was not able to walk, and he was referred to Warm Springs as a place to go for rehabilitation. And he loved it there. So he started going there in 1924. And not long after he started going there, he up and bought the resort. It was a sort of a late 19th century resort town that had fallen on hard times. The big hotel had burned a couple of times and had then been rebuilt. So Roosevelt swoops in and he actually buys the resort, the whole place, so he could control that, and made it into this rehabilitation facility with the pools and whatnot. So this is where Roosevelt was in April of 1945, posing for a portrait when he had a stroke and died. So he visited this site on a regular basis during the time when he was governor of New York and then president of the United States. He died there. And according to the terms of his will, it was given, at the time it was given to the state, which created that memorial commission to manage the site. And the commission managed it until 1980 when they handed it over to the Department of Natural Resources. So everything is there exactly as it was when Roosevelt died in April of 1945. The furnishings, everything is just sort of frozen in time. And then on your right there is absolutely one of my favorite sites, but it's only open about 10 minutes a month, unfortunately now. It's not very well staffed. It's run by a volunteer docent. Traveler's Rest. Anybody ever been to Traveler's Rest? Okay, one person. It's fantastic. It's up near Toccoa. It truly is only, I think it's open like maybe 3 or 4 Saturdays a month or something. I don't know. And sometimes on Sundays, but it's fantastic. It is a site that dates, this particular building dates to the 1830s. It was an inn along the Unicoi Pike, which was a toll road that was built by a group of white men in conjunction with a group of Cherokees to essentially facilitate travel across North Georgia. And this was one of the premier inns. It was a stagecoach stop in that section of Georgia along the Unicoi Pike. It is fantastic. It's about, the porch runs the whole length of this house, and it's breathtaking how big it is. But it's another case where the same family owned this house from 1830 until it was given over to the state in the 20th century, in the mid-20th century, when the last member of the family had to move out of there because she was elderly and didn't feel like she could live in this sort of remote area any longer. So it has been very much preserved and taken good care of. It's just not open very much because it doesn't get a lot of visitors. But it's a National Historic Landmark. It's a fantastic site. If you can get up to Toccoa, I strongly encourage you to visit it. As I was working on this project, our special projects group at the Department of Museums, Archives, and Rare Books at Kennesaw State actually was asked by the Department of Natural Resources to redo all of their brochures for their state historic sites. So this was one of these sort of synchronicity things that worked out really well, where I was already going out to visit all these sites, and I was sending all my students out to visit all these sites, and our special projects team needed somebody out visiting all the sites to take pictures and to fact check things. And so if you go and visit any of these sites, you'll get one of these new brochures now that is part of what our special projects group produced 2 years ago now, I guess, for the Department of Natural Resources. So we sort of standardized the look of these, and we also updated a lot of the content. So, for instance, we incorporated this information about slavery at the Chief Vann House. Stevens, the A.H. Stevens site, I would say the interpretation that you get out of this little brochure is better than what you're going to get at the site right now. They have some work to do there at that site. But anyway, we're trying. We're working with them. But the state has done some good things. They have updated some of their interpretation. They have added this one panel here at the Stevens site that talks about some of the enslaved people who lived and worked there. The Chief Vann House, as a result of work by Ty Miles, the historian, one of the rangers there, took on this project of talking about the enslaved people there. And so we're starting to see some broadening of the interpretation at some of these sites. But they still, don't get me wrong, these sites are all fantastic, but they all need more money, they need more people, and they need to do more work updating their interpretation. And the other thing I discovered is the farthest or closest we get to the present in this state system is Roosevelt's Little White House, which takes us to 1945. So there's nothing really newer than that. And this is Georgia, which was like, pretty important in the civil rights movement. And we have no civil rights related sites in our state historic site system. The National Park Service has the Martin Luther King site, and that's great. But the state historic site system really needs to be doing something about civil rights. And I'm always telling these folks down at headquarters that they need to look at this place, Dorchester Academy, which is today owned by a small nonprofit. This was an African-American school that was established in the late 19th century. And then in the 20th century, it becomes a civil rights training school. So Martin Luther King and other leaders of the civil rights movement would go down here and they would stay in these dorms at this Dorchester Academy. And this is where they would train folks in nonviolence. So that's something that I very strongly believe needs to be added to our system, as well as continuing to update the interpretive programs at these various sites. Stevens, Pickett's Mill, and Fort McAllister are really lacking. The Cherokee sites are sort of moving in the right direction. The plantations, Hawful Broadfield, is actually done some pretty good stuff. The others really need to kind of up their game a little bit. But all of these sites, like I said, need more money. They need more staff. But go and visit these sites, because that's what's going to drive this for these sites to get more staff and more money. So the book is out now. You can buy the book here from the museum tonight. There's some little stickers and buttons up here if anybody's interested in those. As I mentioned, this was a student project in many ways. So a lot of the chapters in this book were co-authored by students. Kathrine is one of those students who was in this class, and I'll hand it off to her and she can talk about her experience.
I have to pull up my PowerPoint. Hang on, y'all. Okay. So my chapter was on the Etowah Indian mounds, which is kind of cool that I ended up here at the Bartow History Museum, like an hour away, not even an hour away from the mounds. So the mounds, I'm sure most of y'all have been to them because it is so close, but they are made up of 3 earthland mounds right next to the Etowah River. And what's really cool is there's actually still a fish trap made out of rocks from the 1800s there. If you walk down and see it, don't go when it's really hot because you will get ate up with mosquito bites. And then there's a defensive ditch there as well. You can't really see it in this picture. And one of the things that I found in my research is that whenever it was first made, that it was just Georgia red clay. And how they talk about like how stark it would be to see just this like red mound of dirt in the distance like that. So I took this class with Dr. Dickey. I had taken lots of classes with her because my minor was in public history, and she is really big. And I'd already done like a very public-facing thing. I was able to help with the new exhibit at the Oakland Cemetery in November of 2022. There's my picture. And actually, if you know Mackenzie Brick at the Booth Western Art Museum, she is the scheduler over there, and she is standing right behind me. She was excited to know that she was in my PowerPoint. So I already kind of like thought it was cool to see my name in print like that. And Dr. Dickey, I had taken another class with her the previous semester, and she was heavily suggesting that we take this class and that we would probably end up being published. And so I needed to take a research seminar, so I took it. And I knew selfishly that it was really close. I was living in Kennesaw and going to Kennesaw State, and it was very close. I did not want one in Savannah or down in South Georgia. And I always have had a big interest in Native American and indigenous histories. And so I thought that was pretty cool. And I remember visiting the mounds when I was a kid with my dad. So I came up here and did that. So the creation of the mounds, like I said, it has 3 earthen mounds, a museum, a fish trap from the 1800s, and it actually has some cool walking trails. I recently went up there and did that. So the mounds themselves, we don't really know about them till the 1540s whenever colonizers start coming over, but it had been around for quite a while. It was in use, continuous use, for about 600 years. from the Mississippian period, or during the Mississippian period. And then kind of because of disease and colonization, it kind of dissipated. And then the Cherokee kind of hung out there for a little bit. And the first written, what's the word I'm looking for? Not example, but like the first time that we see it with colonizers was from Hernando de Soto. And he was like, this is kind of cool. I don't know what this is, but I want to go over there and see what it is. And so that is kind of an artist recreation of what it could have looked like. It had upwards of 3,000 people living there at one time. So it was a bustling city. For comparison, Cartersville has about 24,000, so not that big. But and then the picture on the right is the diorama they have still currently at the museum of what the town would have looked like. And with the 3 mounds, the chief would have lived at the biggest one at the very top, so you could keep an eye on everybody. And it was a very hierarchical system. And it's super well preserved, and it gives a lot of insight into the Mississippian culture of the Etowah people. And so we'll talk about it in a second, but there's been a lot of issues with archaeology and preservation and stuff. So the land lottery and the Tumlins. So the land lottery started in the early 1800s, and it forced Cherokee and all Native people off of their land. And this land was given to white people here in Georgia who were coming here to colonize. And the families were forcibly removed, and this was kind of the kickstart to the Trail of Tears. And it was in this land lottery, the Tumlins got it. And there's 2 Lewises in this story, which is very confusing whenever you're trying to do research. And one of those people is Lewis Tumlin. He was kind of the guy who was like, we should do something with this. And then there's also Lewis Larson, which I'll talk about in a second. But the first time that people are able to take a look at what the mounds, archaeologically, what they have, was verbal permission given by the Tumlin grandmother to the Smithsonian. Some people came down from the Smithsonian Institutes. And then they kind of do some stuff here and there, but then it really kicks up in the 1950s, like Dr. Dickey was saying. And then we have some minutes from the Etowah Mounds Committee. And this is something I found in my research. And it's talking about, like, what do we do? It's kind of a mess right now. We need to figure it out. And at the time, they weren't as culturally aware or sensitive. And so they were just kind of digging stuff up. And we can see that picture. Lewis Larson finds a fireplace, which is really, really cool. But of course, there wasn't a lot of input from the ancestors of those who lived there. And then these are some pictures from 1918. So this is the Tumlin farm with the mounds in the distance. If y'all have been there and you saw my first picture, it looks completely different. Because for a while, they didn't really know how much stuff was in there, how well preserved it was. And I just thought those were kind of cool pictures. I found those in my research too. And then this is when it opened in 1958. And you can see that there's still some trees on the sides. We know today that there's no trees. And there's the big opening. The governor comes out. They open the archaeological museum. At that point, it wasn't super text-based. It was all artifact-based, which once again, there wasn't a whole lot of input. There wasn't any input from the indigenous people whose ancestors lived there. But I always think it's really cool to look at articles from the time period. So Tumlin to Larson. So this was in 1953. We can see that they're just kind of digging down and trying to figure out what's in there. So Tumlin said, yeah, y'all can go in, do what you need to do. And then students with Larson went in 1958. And they did a lot of work there. And they got a whole bunch of stuff, and a lot of that stuff was in the museum for a really long time. I'll talk about that in a second. And then we can see it kind of transform. But we can also see still in the 50s that they weren't being super culturally sensitive. They had a reporter, Ken Hogg. They let him go down in there. So not only are they letting just randos down there doing whatever they want, he doesn't know what he's doing, and they're not being super sensitive. But we can see here in 1975 that they had trees on the side. They still had that super tall staircase. And I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but like less than 40% of it to this day has been excavated. So we don't know a whole lot about it. I actually had a friend recently at Kennesaw State. He went and did a dig there, a little bit of it, which is funny because we grew up together and neither of us knew that we were doing stuff there. And then I saw him and he's like, "What have you been up to?" And I was like, "This." He's like, "Oh, no way, I was there too." So that was kind of a cool moment. So the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990. So this is where we start to see people are like, hey, we didn't really talk to anybody about if these items are important, what they signify. And it says of 1990, it is 2025. And the museum just got updated 3 years ago. And I'll talk about it more in a second. How many times am I going to say that? But whenever I wrote the book, it was still it still had all these old artifacts. So that was something that I talked about. And now it's really updated. It's fantastic if y'all have the opportunity to go. There's still a few. They have a canoe in there. They have a fish trap. And they still have the older film still playing. But all of those artifacts are out. And it's still called the Archaeological Museum. We can see that's kind of what it used to look like. We can see that they try to talk about these things that they don't have a connection to. And so they're just not able to explain it as well. And then, so here is November of 2023. It talks about the revamping of its museum. I finished writing this paper in the spring of 23. So I beat them to it. It's written down forever. And this is what it looks like now. So where all those glass cases used to be filled with these stolen items, they now have them covered up with these panels, and they're fantastic. And each one of them has a different Etowah or Cherokee word. Like one of them, I think, says food, and it explains different types of things. It talks about river cane, which I actually shoot a blowgun out of river cane here at the museum, so that's cool. But you can see that they have that fish trap up there and then the canoe as well. So they still allow people to be able to see artifacts, because that's one of the main criticisms of this act, is that you're not allowing people to see the history. But I think you can still have a deeper appreciation for it by reading it, and then you get to go out and see it. They still have the older text panels as well out there. Those are harder to update. So you still get to see that, and they have like the Wattle and Daub house that you get to go in and stuff out there. And then this is just a graph of the way that different things were broken up, like if it was completed with a cultural affiliation and stuff like that. Just kind of, I thought it was cool, but kind of boring at the same time. So my experience, I was a student, so I definitely was the perfect student. I never turned anything in late. And Dr. Dickey can attest to that. But we got to do a ton of really cool stuff. We got to go to the Georgia Archives in Morrow, which I actually lost my wallet before we went, so I almost didn't get to go in because you have to have your ID. And I begged and pleaded with them, and I was able to. And I got to hold these really cool artifacts, like that picture of the minutes. I got to see a bunch of committee meeting minutes. So that was really cool. It's also terrifying. You can ask any of my coworkers. I don't like touching the archives because I'm convinced they're going to disintegrate as soon as I touch them. So that was really cool. I'd never been to an archive space like that before. And then I got interviewed, what was that, like 2-3 months ago? And then they had to take our picture. That was
the longest photo shoot ever.
And also, fun fact, they changed the color of my pants. I was wearing red pants, and they changed them to black. And they didn't tell me that, and they were like, here's the article. Then I was like, I don't own black pants like that. I had red pants on. But that's kind of cool. My mom was very proud of me for being written about. And then, okay, I'll talk about that in a second. But my experience was really cool, but also terrifying to like have your words written down and people care enough to read them, but also being the source. I don't remember the exact statistic Dr. Dickey told us, but something like 80% of people trust things that they hear in museums over education, and most of the time their history education ends in high school. So being the expert is terrifying. And every time I'm put in charge of children, that's also terrifying. And then this is just a non sequitur. If you have to get your registration on your car soon, get the historic preservation tag. It goes to support historic downtowns. It's a little bit more money, but $20 of it goes to supporting historic downtowns, and you already have to pay. And you can say you did something good. So I have mine, so if you see a Chevy Blazer with a historic tag, get out of the way, because that is me. So that's all I got. Do we have any questions?
I do. So the first excavations of the mounds took place in the 20s, and those artifacts went to the Smithsonian.
Mhm.
So did those artifacts get returned to the Native Americans?
That I'm not 100% sure on, because that's the Smithsonian. So I would assume so, because the Smithsonian is pretty good about that kind of thing. Do you know, Dr. Dickey?
I don't know specifically about those artifacts. They may be in the American Indian Museum, the Smithsonian, which is
I would believe that.
basically run by the tribes. There's a Native American who is the head of that museum, and everything is done in consultation with the tribes. But so I'm not sure about those particular things. So I do know there are two branches of that. There's the New York branch and then the Washington, D.C. branch of the American Indian Museum. The New York branch has more of the stuff that George Hay collected, some of the stuff from Georgia, as well as a lot of stuff from the West. But I'm not sure about those particular things from the Etowah dig.
Yeah, some of them's been on loan from the Smithsonian to the Tellus had an exhibit on them a couple of years ago, one of the plates.
Interesting.
Yeah.
We actually, in February, we did a white glove event, and I chose to do the Cherokee table, so I got to use some of my information from this and that, talking about like gorgets and stuff. So yeah.
So the sad thing about this site, in case people didn't know, the tribes don't approve for anything to be planted.
Yep.
And all the trees are falling down.
Yep.
Pretty soon it's going to be totally eroded on
Yeah.
the river.
Yeah.
So it's going to be,
Yeah.
it's going to change
Mhm.
dramatically.
Yeah.
What surprised you most in your research?
I don't really think anything. I kind of knew that people were insensitive the whole time. I've been really interested, but I think what surprised me the most was the way that, and this always surprises me in my research, the way that people just like, in like the 1800s, early 1900s, where they were like, they didn't really care about historical sites. They were just like, I don't know, we go live there, we have a farm, we'll hang out. Like, I can't grasp how people can, but I guess it's because I live in a world where we do care, and I'm one of those who care. Yeah.
Why weren't there any trees?
I don't know. Like she said, it may have to do with the fact that they won't allow any planting. And I know there's a lot of invasive species. Like I talked about river cane. It's not really found on the Etowah River anymore because of things like building of highways, other invasive species coming in. So that may have something to do with it. And river cane was used primarily for making like blowguns. The one that I get to shoot. Not very well, but I get to shoot. So yeah, I don't know.
So it was farmland. They would have kept it cleared. And prior to
Yep.
that, they wanted access to the river.
Yep.
Because they wanted the water to overflow.
Yep.
And that soil to dump.
But like I said, in the river, you can still see the rocks. The fish trap itself isn't there, but you can see where they were trying to funnel the fish in,
Yeah, the weir is still there.
which is very cool. Very cool. Yes, Sarah?
I have one question for both of you. What was going on in the 70s? Because, like, everybody's losing houses and the state's, like, collect them all. So, was the economy just, like, in the...
Yes.
Well, yeah, the gas crisis.
Yeah.
I wasn't here
Me either.
for that.
Well, so what was happening was you were starting. There was a shift going on in the case of like Hoffel and the Jarrett, the Jarrell plantation. So these folks, basically, you were, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 generations into these families. And people just didn't want to farm anymore. I mean, there was no money and it was a hard life. And so in the case of Hoffel Broadfield, the last family member who lived there was a single woman who had no descendants. There was no one else alive in the family, and she really felt strongly she wanted the place to be preserved and to remain intact, and sort of her family story to be told. And so sort of the same thing with the Gerald plantation. You know, the surviving family members got together. There was one family member still living on the farm and doing subsistence farming, but there were several family members alive. And they got together and they're like, what are we going to do? You know, like, I mean, the guy who was still living there was like in his 70s and trying to farm. And so they said, well, we want it to be preserved. And first, their first idea was, let's find some rich person who will buy it all and charge admission for people to come see it. It's in the middle of nowhere, for starters, but also no rich person was forthcoming. But the state was interested. Jimmy Carter was governor at the time, and what was he? A peanut farmer, right? So he was really into like preserving this agricultural story. So, but I mean, it was just sort of things kind of playing out with these family members dying off and either having no descendants or, I mean, in the case of Wormslow, it was as much for tax purposes as anything else. The family had created a foundation at one point because the estate taxes they were having to pay were so high that they couldn't afford to keep the land and continue to, you know, pay the taxes on it. So.
Wormslow's an interesting name does that mean anything?
It came from an English name, so yeah. It's not as creepy as it sounds. Yeah. Yeah.
No, Winslow was a house owned by the state anyway. I thought it was separate.
No, the house that the Barrow house is that's outside the state historic site. That's still owned by the family.
Do they have like any relationship, or is it still just
No, other than their neighbors. So the family is not involved in the state historic site, and the state historic site is not involved with the family. I mean, the family does some other things. They have a relationship with the University of Georgia, and that because they have this fantastic library, and they sponsor people to come, and they sponsor through the University of Georgia Press a publication series. But they're separate entities. It's still privately owned by members of the family. The house itself, and it's just where the Tabby ruins are, and sort of the part that was really the plantation that's the state historic site.
You mentioned early on that about the 1931 being the date that this began to acquire the site. And I thought, the first thing I thought was, what a bizarre time in history, in the middle of the Depression, for the state to begin to acquire things. And then you mentioned that the CCC was beginning to do their work.
Yeah.
Is that a synchronous kind of a thing, or do you know anything about that? Why?
Well, kind of. I mean, some of it was just sort of coincidental. So, for instance, this Alexander Stevens site had a ladies' memorial group had gotten control of that site. They had acquired that site, and they had hoped that they were going to be able to start a school there, and they did start a school there that they hoped would have a relationship with the University of Georgia, and that didn't come to fruition. And then they found that like it was kind of expensive to, you know, maintain this house and keep up the site and whatnot. So then they started courting the state and saying, hey, this site is really important and needs to be preserved. Don't you think the state should take it over, and they should build a park around it and all this kind of stuff? So that's kind of how that happened. Some of the others that, you know, there was interest more broadly across the country, beginning, you know, late 19th century, we start to see the first national parks being created, and then the National Park Service is created in 1916. And so we start to see that national park system developing. So the states are starting to look at that and start to think, we need to do something too. And so in some ways, the states were saying, okay, if we take these lands that we can either get for cheap or whatever, however we can acquire them, then we can do these sort of make work programs there as well, right? So the CCC can come in and help us build something there. And so that was part of what was going on as well. So just kind of making use of those federal resources.
Did you have a question, Ellie?
Did you get to pick this site?
Yeah. So
It was a rugby scrum, but yes, she got it.
I got to class. So there was a Google Doc she was going to open, and I got to class like 20 minutes early because I knew I wanted this one. Because, like I said, watch out for the Chevy Blazer with historic preservation tags because I'm not a good driver, so I did not want to drive very far. And so I sat there, and as soon as it opened, I typed my name in the Google Doc, and the rest was history.
Why did you pick this one?
I've always had an interest in like Native history and the way that, especially in Georgia, we push them off their land wrongfully, and how diverse of a history that they have. Because you could talk about, I tell the kids this too, like when we talk about the Cherokee or the Etowah, they're just one group out of hundreds of Native Americans that not only survived but thrived in North America. So, yeah. Mm-hmm. Did you have a question?
I didn't have a question, but when we went to Cave Spring, Georgia, Chief Van had built a little house.
Yeah, there's a cabin there.
And that cabin, and it's right across from where the spring is.
Uh-huh.
We were talking to the guy that owns the little shop and just sold it. He said that they found more than one spring. They've got 3 springs now.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, Van was one of the wealthiest men in the Cherokee Nation, and he had taverns all over the place. In fact, at New Echota, there is a tavern that was relocated from somewhere on the Chattahoochee River that was a Van tavern because New Echota was wiped out after the Cherokee left. It got cleared. It was farmed for many years. It almost became a golf course. So there was only one building left there. So they were looking for buildings to move to the site. So they put this Van tavern that was going to be demolished somewhere else and put it at New Echota.
It's a little bit larger than a tiny house.
Yeah.
But it's 2-story, and I don't know if anybody goes in there or not, but they've got a plaque in front of it.
Mhm.
That says about the place.
Yeah.
You've never seen it kind of boarded up more or less.
Yeah, I haven't been there in a few years. The last time I was there was right after they had discovered what it was. They started pulling the siding off and discovered it was this log house, and then kind of it all started unfolding. So, but I haven't been there since they really kind of fixed it up or whatever. So.
Thank you, Dr. Dickey. Thank you, Kathrine. That was great. I think we're all inspired to go visit these sites now.
Go see them.
And we'll get them stamped each time we go. So
Yeah.
like she said there, if you want a copy of the book to take along on your trip, we've got them at the front desk. They've already been pre-signed, so you're good to go. Thank you all for coming, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time.